Good evening, everyone. This is our panel on April 28th from Holy Trinity Parish in Washington, D.C. We are thinking about the legacy of Pope Francis tonight. We are still praying with and for him as he was buried just 2 days ago. And now also our prayer transitions to thinking forwards to our next Pope and to the conclave that we learned today will be starting on May 7th. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Brian Flanagan. I'm the coordinator for adult faith formation here at Holy Trinity Parish, and I'll introduce our three other speakers in just a moment. But before we do that, I'm going to invite you into a moment of prayer. So however you get comfortable or would like to get comfortable, we are always in the presence of our loving God. It's nice sometimes to stop and pay attention to that and to be present in the moment, however that feels right to you tonight. And I'll begin with a prayer from the Jesuits East province that they had on their website for us and for Pope Francis as we mourn his death. Loving God, today we grieve for our beloved Pope Francis. We know you join us in our grief, that you too weep at the death of your dear friend and companion, as Jesus did at the tomb of Lazarus. Welcome our beloved Pope Francis into your waiting arms. Envelop him in your eternal love. And comfort us in our mourning as we strive to continue to follow his gospel example to encounter Christ in all people and in all places. We thank you for the gift of Pope Francis. Through his life and teaching, you showed us how to love and serve one another, how to hear the cries of the poor and the cries of the earth, and how to respond in compassionate love. Pope Francis, pray for us. Mary, Mother of Sorrows, comfort us. Amen. Well, we have three wonderful panelists with us tonight. I'm going to get them here on screen with me through the wonders of Zoom. And I'm going to introduce them now. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong person. Marcia, I almost put you on spot. Hold on one second. I need to get Father Gillespie. There we go. That's the right four for now. I'm going to introduce them right now. Some of you know some of them already, or at least one of them, one should hope. And then I'll introduce them in the order in which they'll be speaking. They're in our first question, at least. With us tonight, we have Dr. Annie Selak, who's a theologian. Some of you know her from the 9 o'clock hall mass sometimes, where she's there with her children. But she's a theologian and also is the director of the Women's Center over at Georgetown University and works in ecclesiology. Our second panelist is Dr. Bridget O'Brien, who is a theologian as well, and with a wonderful name, just like Brian Flanagan, painfully Irish. And Bridget O'Brien is the director of ministry at Old St. Patrick's Church in Chicago, Illinois. And so we're really grateful to have her with us tonight. And then our third speaker is Father Kevin Gillespie of the Society of Jesus, our pastor here at Holy Trinity Church, who's bringing some of his own wisdom and knowledge here with us tonight. And as I said, the chat is open. So if you have a question that comes up right away, you can always put it in the chat, and then I'll be figuring out a way for us to raise hands and answer questions more interactively about halfway through our time together this evening. So my first question, and again, I'll start with Annie. Who was Pope Francis to you? Is there an image? Is there a moment? Is there a word? Is there something in his ministry, something in his pontificate that is going to stick with you as we remember his legacy tonight?
Yeah, well, it's great to be with everyone in this setting. To me, very simply, Pope Francis is the namesake of my child. When my spouse and I were thinking of who do we want this child to be in the world, what are our hopes for her, Pope Francis embodied that. How could she be someone who treats others with mercy? How can the changes that he starts in the church be something that she run with? So that's who Pope Francis is for me. Now, an image, since you also asked about that, Brian, images that stick with me from him, and one that I'm finding has been bouncing around my mind since early Saturday morning when there was the funeral, is the image of his Black orthopedic shoes that he was buried in. Right. So most popes wear the red Prada shoes. I don't know about y'all, but if I had a chance to wear red Prada shoes, I would. And that is what he chose to be buried in. That's what he did his ministry in. I think it speaks to his simplicity, the way that he truly embodied simplicity, right? From where he lived to what he wore on a daily basis to what he was buried in.
Yeah. And if you look at the photos from his burial, they were not particularly sort of high-end black shoes, orthopedic shoes at that. They'd seen a lot, and they were, I think, on a lot of his journeys around the world as Pope, and even perhaps before Pope.
Yeah, they got some good use.
Yeah. Thanks, Annie. And it's wonderful to think about Frankie too, about your daughter, as we remember Pope Francis and think about the past and our future. Bridget, tell us a little bit about what you're thinking about who Pope Francis has been in it for you.
Sure. So, hello, it's good to be here. You know, if any of you ever find yourselves in Chicago, please know that you're very welcome to Old St. Patrick's. Since Pope Francis was in the hospital, I'm going to cheat a little and give two images, because the interplay between them has really been sitting with me. And that's, on the one hand, the image of him sort of achingly alone during the early days of the pandemic, raising the monstrance in St. Peter's Square to bless the world, and to call us to solidarity and to prayer, and to go out from our loneliness that so many of us were experiencing in that moment, and to come together as people and pray toward a future that expressed solidarity and union with those who were made most vulnerable. And then on the other hand, him in a room that was very full of other people, seated at a round table during the Synod on Synod Alley, and just seated at one of these circular tables in that sort of equality with everyone else, to sit together and listen to so many different perspectives, and to call the church to learn how to listen more to one another, to the world. So those two images of him alone and him in this room of the global church.
Thanks, Bridget. Yeah, we're so glad you're with us here tonight. Father Kevin?
Well, first of all, a brother Jesuit, a companion of Jesus, who is a companion with my religious community, and set ideals that he lived out, the sufferings of Jesus that had won praise during the spiritual exercises, that if it's God's will, and he certainly had his ups and downs in his Jesuit journey. But what a model. And as a fellow Jesuit, once upon a time, 10 years ago, when I served as president of the Jesuit University in St. Joe's in Philly, we felt, hey, here was an opportunity through the Eucharistic Congress of 2015 to invite him to St. Joseph's. But how do we do that when there were so many people wanting to come to this campus, come to this campus? Well, we sort of created a conspiracy, I call it. You see, St. Joseph, that still does, has a very distinguished Jewish Catholic Institute. And the two leaders, a Jewish scholar and Philip Cunningham, a Catholic theologian, met in my office when I was president, and we hatched a plot. And we knew that the Pope was going to be in town, Philadelphia, but we wanted him to visit our campus. So what we did was, let's, first of all, how do we get him? We get him through his rabbi, Rabbi Skorkov, who was a good friend of his, an Argentinian, with whom he wrote a book, with whom he had a television show. We figured we get the rabbi, we get the Pope. And how do we draw him? We commissioned a sculpture through a Jewish benefactor called Synagogia et Ecclesia, church, synagogue and church, which was really two women who were equals in fighting the anti-Semitism that was promulgated by Nostra Aetate, that Catholics in the Vatican II document were really trying to alert ourselves to the sensitivity of the Jewish community's suffering. And so on that anniversary, that year, we said, we're going to create a sculpture of speaking to the equality of the Jewish Christian identity. Two women, one reading the Torah, one reading the New Testament. So we got this statues commissioned. I commissioned it. On the Friday of the weekend that the Pope was in town, I sort of dedicated it. And then 2 days later, the Pope blessed it. And we got him in town with his Jewish rabbi friend. And it's still there as an image in front of St. Joseph's University, but an image of Jewish Catholic relations, of we're brothers and sisters together. So I felt in the conspiracy, he fell into our trap, and there we have an icon for Jewish Catholic relations.
It's good to remember that in the original Latin, conspiratio wasn't necessarily a negative term. It just meant being in the same spirit, perhaps even spirit. Yeah. Thanks, Father Kevin. I'll say for myself, I mean, there's so many images that come to mind. One of them is one that Father David Hollenbach talked about yesterday morning as well. That would have been one of mine, and he hadn't brought it up. Was the Pope's first trip to Lampedusa, his first trip outside of the Vatican as Pope, where he went to an island just off the coast of Sicily. That was one of the places where lots of refugees, at that point, both refugees coming from sub-Saharan Africa, but also coming from Syria under war and from other parts of the Middle East, were trying desperately and often dying in the process to get to Europe. And the Pope decided he wanted to go. And in fact, he didn't quite know how to do this, and he just wanted to go. And so he started calling and trying to make his own plane reservations. And his staff finally said, "No, Holy Father, you can't do that. We've got to go through the system." But he went down there, and an artist took a boat that had capsized, a boat that had migrants, and he used that as the altar. And that connection ritually and liturgically of the poor, marginalized, and crucified of our world with the poor, marginalized, and crucified one that we worship every Sunday. From the moment that he tried to make that experience central, that was a big moment for me. And the other, of course, has to be when on an airplane shortly thereafter, and someone asked him about a gay priest, and he said, "Well, a man is gay and follows the Lord, who am I to judge?" And this whole change of tone, not church teaching, but change of tone that has really changed the conversation on LGBTQ Catholics. And many of you know at Holy Trinity Parish, we have a very active LGBTQIA+ community. And the idea that a pope would use the word gay, the chosen word of community to describe their own experience, was another moment where lots of people looked up and went, "Well, this is different than what we've experienced in the past." I want to ask a question now about, well, okay, we have these images, we have these moments, and I'm sure many of you who are here with us have your own images and moments that are coming to mind. What do you think will be his legacy in 5 years, in the shorter term? I'm going to ask you a question later about the longer term, but in 5 or 10 years, what do you think people are going to remember Pope Francis for? What do you think his effect on the church is going to be in that shorter term? And we'll go in the same order. I'll ask if you guys go with Annie, and then Bridget, and then Father Kevin.
I think in the short term, what we're going to see are a lot of the church teachings and practices that Pope Francis inaugurated. I think we're going to see a lot around there. So by that, I mean, Laudato Si, his encyclical on the environment. I mean, Holy Trinity has solar panels now, right? Like that is significant. So I think things like that, as the climate crisis continues to impact the world in new ways, I think his call to care for our common home will be really important. Also one that, as an ecclesiologist, I do think will be part of his legacy, but I also say this as a hope, is that his calls around synodality, right? So the Synod on Synodality is about the way the church is church. The church listens to itself. The church actualizes it. And synodality is a long-held practice, but he re-inaugurated this in a really special and important way. So when he first started doing the synods, first he allowed a non-ordained man, a brother, Christian brother, to vote. It's like, whoa, how could he do that? Then he allowed women religious in the room. And then by the most recent one, we had college students voting, right? That these are ways that the church is called to listen, to be church. I even think at Holy Trinity, how when we were discerning what banners to have in front of the church, we had conversations in the spirit. And that's something that if 5 years ago you would have asked me, I would have said, well, one, what's a conversation in the spirit? But two, how would that even work? What do you mean? We're not just going to all sit in a room and debate it. So I think he called us to really exercise that muscle of synodality that's always been in the church, but is one that we haven't used. So my hope is that in 5 years, so the synod called that in 3 years, we're supposed to gather together as a global church again. And in 2 years, that's supposed to be nationally. So this year, it's supposed to be in our parishes. So my hope is that in 5 years, we have gone through another global synod and are preparing for the next one.
Yeah, we've some of you are familiar with all the things we've done, and we'll be familiar with more of how we're going to keep trying to be more synodal in our parish through our pastoral council, through our work together, through our conversations together. One thing I've said for a while is if the Synod on Synodality is the last global synodal process of its kind, then the Pope will have failed. And I think my hope is that part of his legacy will be not that we just have those muscles, but we get off the metaphorical couch and use them more regularly. Bridget, what about you? Where do you think we'll be how do you think we'll be remembering Pope Francis in 5 years? Or what do you think we'll be remembering about him in 5 years?
Yeah, I think that he called the church and practiced himself going to the peripheries and putting himself in places where he could directly hear as many people as possible and listening deeply to that. And even in places that I personally, or that many of us would hope for more change, for more shift in official teaching, there was always that prioritization of accompanying actual concrete people and meeting actual people in their humanity. And not just waiting for them to come to him, but him saying, right, I'm going to go to Lampedusa. I'm going to, he talked about having been called from the far corner of the world to become Pope. And then he didn't just stay in the Vatican to do that. But from the moment of saying, I'm not going to live in the Apostolic Palace, I don't want to be at the top of this sort of inverted funnel where there are fewer and fewer people, but I'm going to repeatedly put myself in situations where I can hear more people. And opening from that listening, opening and empowering conversations that couldn't have happened 15 years ago, and saying that at the highest levels of the church, we are going to talk about issues that had been off the table. And I think that once that is sort of uncorked, it's hard to shove everything back in. So I think that 5 years from now, we're going to be saying, okay, what's been the fruit of these conversations that once they started, could not be stopped.
Thanks, Bridget. Brother Kevin?
Building on what Bridget and Annie said, the Jubilee year has begun, and it has set in motion every other week. There is some group in Rome being honored. Coincidentally, yesterday was adolescents, the youth, and the fact that following their funeral, thousands of young people throughout the world converged in Rome as part of the Jubilee year. A couple of weeks, there'll be another group, scientists, artists. That has a momentum beyond the death and life, or the life and death of Pope Francis. Concretely, in our parish, our children, our grade school had a special ceremony where they came together. What was the impact? And the children talked about mercy, how he was bringing us to the mercy of God. Yesterday was Divine Mercy Sunday, and it was just a natural flow. Brian, you mentioned it in your reflection at the 7:30 Mass. And to give that freedom to build on so that the next generation remembers this Pope and say, I felt a more connection. In that sense, I think we have more confidence and therefore courage as a people of faith in the Catholic, rather than, of course, the humiliation and the shame of the sexual abuse and the guilt, rightly so. That's still there, but I think he ushered in a way of being saying, when we're true with Christ's teachings and honest and transparent, amazing things could happen. And he showed the way, and his spirit will continue to lead the way.
Yeah. Thanks, Father Kevin. Yeah, I mean, I'll add my own 2 cents on this. I mean, I think the other thing that from how the church looks and acts that I think can't be underestimated is that this is the first pope in centuries from outside of Europe, but will not be the last. And in a church that historically went from being in West Asia to suddenly being perceived as European, we are leaving that era. Karl Rahner back 50 years ago talked about the world church and the transition from a Roman church or a Mediterranean church to a world church. And I think now we're seeing this, that the Pope's bringing perspectives. It's a little tricky, right? And sometimes difficult for those of us coming from the United States, especially, who are used to kind of being the center of most of the conversations in our world, to see why somebody from other parts of the world might bring different angles, perspectives, questions. But I'm hoping that that opening continues, not just in the cardinals, but in the way in which our church continues to actually involve dialogue throughout our Catholic world. For a second question, I'm going to ask you to speculate wildly, right? It's 500 years from now. It's the year 2525 in the Catholic Church. We think of some of our popes that we look back on, that we know their names of. Gregory the Great. Anyone called the Great is usually a tell that people thought he was pretty important. But how do you think history is going to look at Pope Francis in the longer term? How might Catholics or how might theologians look back on what he did as Pope in this period, or the way that he led the papacy and led the church in this time? Annie, you want to speculate wildly for us?
I love to speculate wildly. I mean, part of the hard part of this question, other than the 500 years part, is that I think a huge part of the answer to that question will depend on who the next pope is, right? Because Francis might be remembered as the first pope to inaugurate these reforms, or not, right? Like that who follows next, I think, will be a big part of that. But my real answer to this is for a pope who knew how images spoke to people. And, we could talk about images of him washing the feet of people imprisoned on Holy Thursday and things like that. I'm going to give a very boring answer, but with my ecclesiology hat on. Curia reform. So the Curia is the bureaucracy of the Vatican. And that was something in the general congregations leading up to Pope Francis's election. He talked about the need for a Curia reform. He also came in at undertime. Each cardinal is given a designated amount of time to speak, and he came in under that time. Most people go over, and people say that helped seal the deal for his election. But I think something as boring as who is in the administration of the Vatican is going to have a lasting impact. An issue that I care about a lot is the role of women in the church. And I think rightfully so. There's some critiquing around, like, did Francis really get that topic? Did he push for reforms enough there? No, he didn't. But one area that I think he did really well on was he removed the requirement that the head of Curia offices needed to be cardinals. So we see women in these roles. And my favorite trivia fact building up to conclave is that one of those women was accidentally invited to the conclave because they just went and invited all the heads of Curia because that's what they'd done before. For so many years, only cardinals had held that role. And now we have women holding those roles. So I think that's something that's going to far outlive Pope Francis. And that if he becomes known as Francis the Great, it will be because of that Curia reform.
Thanks, Annie. Bridget, long term.
Yes, well, I won't speculate wildly, but I will say what I hope is the long-term memory. And I hope that that is this is where the church learned how to truly receive Vatican II. And I hope that in 500 years, we won't be able to discuss Vatican II without discussing Francis and synodality, and taking us away from a sort of debate that happens solely in heads and in inflamed passions about, well, is Vatican II continuous with what was before, or is it discontinuous with what was before? Is it a big rupture? Is it the same? And a call to a more reflective spiritual practice that involves the entirety of the people of God, learning together how to hear one another and how to hear the Holy Spirit. And so I hope that in 500 years, when we're talking about, when not we, but when the church is talking about its evolution of self-understanding, that people will say, okay, this is when the church really started to understand what some of these calls meant.
If I may tune in some ways, Francis reminds me of Pope John the 23rd, and how when he died, and I remember praying as a seventh grader about the impact, and how John the 23rd had conversations with world leaders about peace, nuclear arms, pacem terrors, that impact. And what was given right there on Saturday, an iconic picture of two world leaders whom he dealt with, Zelensky and Francis, coming together at least in a better way than the last time they met. Pope Francis, many people don't realize, he made a very strong statement against nuclear arms. And where we are 50 years, if what's going to happen to the globe, and the anxiety that was certainly prevalent in the early 60s is still with us. Nuclear arms have proliferated. Pope Francis and all of his successors have to deal with it vis-a-vis where is the world going. So I believe he's, in a John the 23rd way, he encountered it to the extent that looking at peace, looking at justice is a pattern that, God willing, will continue in the leadership of the Catholic Church.
I'm partially stealing this from Father David the other day, but I think it's still true, and I hope I would have thought of some of it on my own. There's two things that I think in 500 years we'll definitely remember him for, that are rooted in these, what I think are the two more substantive of his encyclicals. And one of them was what Father Kevin was just talking about, this question of how do we have a new international order and new politics. So his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, siblings all, about siblinghood, brotherhood, fraternity, but that's the more male language. But asking us, he talks about sort of like, how do we have political love or political charity for each other across our divides of religious difference, across our divides of political difference. There may be reasons in the United States context in 2025 that this is particularly on many of our minds. But I think that's going to be a lasting contribution of continuing to rethink how within a democratic structures and democratic order, and even within the church itself, do we learn how to agree and disagree with each other while still respecting each other. And the other thing I think that still can't be underestimated is Laudato Si, as Annie said. Then our shout out to our green team at Holy Trinity, which has us composting everything. We have a speaker coming next week, I'll tell you about at the end. But to think through, I think in 500 years, people will say, okay, this is when the Catholic Church, which had been firm in its support of environmental activism, really got serious and made it a central point of their action. And especially if that is able to motivate us towards greater addressing climate change and other forms of environmental degradation and other forms of societal degradation that are talked about in Laudato Si, then I'll be quite happy. Before we go to other questions, I've got one more question to ask the three of our panelists. Is there anything you wish Francis had done that he didn't do? Or any places where you wished he went a little further, or any places where he disappointed you? I mean, we asked him in our opening prayer to pray for us. I stole that from the Jesuits for the record. But are there any places where you're hoping for more growth in the church still, or want to hope the church further develop some of the doors that he opened? And anyone can start on that one. That's the harder question. That didn't.
Well, of course, the question of women's diaconate, he sort of kicked down the road, but he could have processed through the synod. The committees are supposed to look at it more seriously. But I know from a couple of friends who are scholars in the area, Phyllis Agana, for one, she expressed in the NCR her disappointment. And she was on that committee because it got so far, and then it sort of that, and also what's done in the Amazon, the whole thing of ministry, of how they were experimenting, and it's sort of, they dropped the ball a bit. So I think there were a couple of things that have been kicked down the road for maybe, but not now kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'll expand that to the question of gender in general. And there's so much to love and to be profoundly grateful for about Pope Francis. And if I can have only the limitations that he had, I will be grateful to God. But certainly one of the places you saw those limitations was a real entrenchment in the gender binary. And that came when he would try to talk about the contributions of women and say unfortunate things like, oh, well, women theologians are like strawberries on the cake. Or the discussion of the experience of trans people and identification of that with gender ideology. So on the one hand, you had this real openness to people and the beautiful image of trans women as some of the last people to sort of bid him goodbye officially and being part of his funeral. And then on the other hand, some statements that were not reflective of the general pastoral sensitivity that he embodied.
Yeah, I would affirm both of those. One of the things I've been thinking a lot about Francis and the role of women comes from the teaching of the final document from the synod. And I'll place a link in the chat of the final document of the synod. And so this paragraph 60 addresses women's roles. Right, and as Father Kevin said, they kind of kicked the can. And in fact, Women's Ordination Conference did this great public art campaign in Rome saying, don't kick the can, women can be priests too, with the like Warhol, like there's some great images out there. But in this paragraph, so in this authoritative teaching document from the church, the document says that what the Holy Spirit started can't be stopped. Right. And so I think that's also something that I keep coming back to and keep finding hope in, that if these reforms were started by the Spirit, then they'll far outlive Francis's papacy. Right. So that's where my current thinking around that is. Another area that I'd highlight of, an area I wish he would have done more in surrounds clergy sex abuse. I think he started some important gatherings and inroads, and I think a lot of his, again, reform of the Curia addresses that. But I think there were ways where he let the overwhelming nature of the crisis stand in the way of really good progress. So I wish he would have done more there. Now, I also think, like, I've been really impressed with his apologies. He would apologize. He traveled to Canada to apologize to First Nations peoples at their request on their land. He would use words like, I'm sorry, instead of like, ooh, one should be sorry and express remorse for bad things. He's like, I apologize. Like, he really lived into that in a new way that I found inspiring, but I also think were baby steps where I wish he would have taken big leaps.
Mm-hmm. We have some time now for some questions from you, and there's two ways of doing that. One is to put something in the chat, and I've seen a couple in there, and I'll relay them to the whole group. The other is if you look on your screen under the little react button at the bottom of your screen, there's a thing there that says raise hands, and then you get what Katie has already done there and raise your hands. So I'm going to call on a couple of people as you raise hands, and we've got a couple of questions out on the table, and then we'll bring them back to our panelists for conversation. So Katie, why don't you go ahead and share, there you go. Go ahead and ask your question. And always with these, it's a great idea if you could ask your question in the form of a question. But we're glad that you're here to ask that. Go ahead, Katie.
Okay. Thank you all for sharing your reflections. My question is, what do we think is the likelihood that we're going to see more reforms in the next Pope? I would love to see married clergy, women clergy. I would love to see gay people getting married. Plus other things you guys already mentioned. I know I'm a dreamer, but do we think that people are going to retrench or move forward with progress?
Great. And there's a similar question in the chat of could there be a conservative, and I think thinking about the next Pope, a conservative going back, sort of a reaction to Pope Francis's papacy. Other questions, either you can put them in the chat or raise your hand, and then we'll bring them all together for our panelists in a moment. Another question in the chat is about the question, are there any American cardinals that might be Pope next? Any Americans who are important leaders? Well, so let's start with those two. The question of, are the reforms that Pope Francis is hoping for and that many of us seem to be hoping for going to happen? And then the question of are there any Americans going forward who are on your short list? Anyone want to take any of those?
Well, if I'll say, I don't think any Americans have a chance, but who would have thought a South American? I think, as Brian, you hinted at before, I think the axis away from Western powers, if you will, whether Europe or the United States, has the ceiling has been broken. We've had a South American. I think people, very good chance that it could be an African or an Asian, particularly the cardinal in the Philippines. We were talking to the Jesuits at night, the similar question. The favorite name is Cardinal Pizzabella, the dancing pizza. He is the cardinal in Jerusalem who's got a lot of negotiating power. He's Italian, but he's done a lot of stuff between Israelis and Palestinians in an admirable way. Although we were talking again, who's running the church right now is a Irish-born, American-grown, Washington, then Dallas, Archbishop Farrell. If any of you saw a conclave, he's the guy that's organizing the conclave. So that's as close, I think, we'll see American in our lifetime. Although I'm certainly admiring Cardinal McElroy, our new Archbishop. But I don't think he'd be the guy. So, but if Bridget and Annie, if you want to respond to that too.
There might be enough Americans running things these days.
Yeah.
What about, well, maybe not anymore. What about some of the reforms, Katie's question about can we expect some of these reforms to continue to grow, to move forward? Any thoughts on that, Annie or Bridget?
I find myself really torn on this, right? Even as you were asking, Katie, I was like, no, I don't think those reforms were going to happen. I'm like, well, what the Spirit started can't be stopped. And so this is, I think the things that what I want to lift up for this gathering of people is that those reforms, like having, blessing the marriages, and recognizing the sacramentality of LGBTQ marriages, like that is well within reforms that could happen, right? And there's some ways that can feel really far off, but that is absolutely something that could happen, right? I think it's important for us to remember that things like the marriage being a sacrament wasn't handed to us on stone tablets by Jesus, right? That these are practices and they're tradition, and that's important. And they're absolutely things that church practice can change around as well. The other thing I'll say about papal candidates too, while I'm unmuted, right? This is something that I have found myself like not wanting to touch with a 10-foot pole of who this will be or not. Whereas when we did this session on Sunday, Father Hollenbach came in with his top 4 candidates. He's like, here's our May Madness of our top 4 candidates. It was wonderful. But my sincere hope is that it is someone that we haven't heard of, right? Like there's 10 or so names really being floated. And my hope is that the next pope is not one of those 10 names. Not because I don't think those 10 people could be great, but my hope is that it is similarly someone who's off our collective radar, just as Pope Francis was.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. A question that I've been sitting with in myself in the past week is whether sort of as I get into middle age, I've just leveled out too much and lost some of the prophetic edge that maybe I had when I was younger. But I do feel a real consciousness of the importance of the Pope as a figure of unity. And I read yesterday, it's a short book. You can read it in sort of one sitting if you've got a span of time in the middle of the day, as I did. The sort of book length interview, Let Us Dream, that's just sort of written continuously in Francis's voice, where he talks about the importance of different people in the church having patience with one another. And I think that whoever the Pope is, it will not be absent from his mind the splits that other Christian traditions have gone through. And so as much as there are reforms that I perhaps would desire and do in fact hope and pray for, I'm not insensitive to the importance of the unity of the church and the reality that the things that I hope and pray for are not the only hopes and prayers of a global church. And to that point, yeah, I think that there's a sort of excitement of, oh, is the Pope going to be someone who's close to us in terms of hoping for an American? But there would be that danger of what would it mean for the United States, particularly in this time, to exist as the United States with our current president and to have a Pope. So I think that when I think of that, I think more of who have been the US cardinals who have been efficient in preaching the message that Francis has embodied, and the importance of Cardinal McElroy in DC and Cardinal Supich here in Chicago, where I am, of saying, this is the message of mercy, and calling us in the United States to embody that, and calling us to stand up for the rights of migrants, and to say that the way that people are being demonized and scapegoated and very viscerally punished for their origins is not the Christian way.
I could add too, Brian, what Bridget says, and Annie. Today's New York Times front page is a very good article on how the tensions between unity and diversity, what the cardinals are thinking, and the sense of you need both. But some cardinals who are going to be voting are saying we need to have a stronger unity, aka conservatism, versus some are saying, yeah, unity is important, but we need to continue to expand, read progressivism. So that's, if you will, the polarities that the conclave has to address, one side or the other. It's an excellent article that I recommend, front page of today's New York Times.
Yeah, and it's the danger here is for the ecclesiologist in me to nerd out way too much, right? But it's not just a question for the conclave, it's a question for us as the church too. I think you could see that in Pope Francis's ministry, where he recognized he had his own opinions sometimes and might even have wanted to go further on some things, but also recognized that the main job of the Pope is to keep the church in communion. And I like the word of communion more than unity, even as it's being used, because communion is not uniformity. Communion is diversity. Communion is allowing the church to be different in different places and cultures and peoples. But it's also why no sane person should ever want to be pope, because you are spending a lot of time balancing how do I, if you look at the image of the bishop from the logo of the Synod on Synodality, the bishop's not in the front and the bishop's not supposed to be in the back. The bishop's supposed to be with the people. And as a Catholic Church in the world, we are a very diverse group of people, a very diverse body of Christ at the moment. I have a question from the chat about the Pope thinking about technology, and there was a recent statement about AI, but asking how likely is it for the new Pope to be as in the real world and as close to the people as Pope Francis was? And a second question, again, we're starting to get into the fun game of who's going to be Pope next. How likely would it be for there to be another Jesuit, another Franciscan, another member of religious order to be elected as Pope? Any thoughts on that, on how close to the ground might the next Pope be, and also on technology, also on the religious orders?
Well, certainly they need to be informed. One of the things, to Francis' credit, he got into social media, and in a good way. How far does a Pope go around that? And certainly AI. What you do have are consultants that the leaders, whether it's AI or technologies, these pontifical institutes, I think there are 9 of them in every field of science and literature. They're not necessarily Catholics on that, but they're ways to keep the leadership in the church informed. What is the cutting edge, whether it's IA or social media or literature or arts? It's really the church at its best. And I think Francis, by the way, he was a chemist. He taught literature and as a young Jesuit. He really embodied not that he was a jack of all trades, but he really put a sense of the Catholicity of and a sort of a renaissance of connecting disciplines. You know, he has that approach to all knowledge is connected, all the science. It's expressed in Laudato Si. Some of that comes straight out of Thomas Aquinas. The truth is united, moving us towards God. He put a 21st century version of that. So I would hopefully, one way or the other, the new leadership has to keep in touch with social media, but yet not let technology dictate the values, but get the Catholic moral values interface and where needed to be a corrective to some of the dynamics of technology.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what I hear in that question too is the sense of how will the next Pope position himself in relation to the church, to the world, right? And again, as we've said, Pope Francis, one of the things he did so well was go to the peripheries. And it's so hard to imagine a Pope not doing that now, right? I could not imagine a Pope sticking to Vatican City. I could not imagine a Pope who isn't with those who are most marginalized, the most vulnerable in the world. I mean, I think one of the questions in my mind is, will the next Pope live in the papal apartment in the papal palace or not, right? When he's elected, will he go out in the red garments or not? Those sorts of things. So I think the question about technology is connected to so many of these other questions for me. In terms of will it be someone from a religious order or not, you know, again, my gut reaction to that was like, oh, there's no way we could have someone from a religious order. Again, they're totally gonna go back to the normal fold. But then, right, like after that gut reaction and sitting with it, I'm thinking that one of the things I suspect Francis's papacy did or is doing is show that there's a variety of ways to be Pope. Right? I don't think we'll have a replica of Francis. I don't think that's possible. But what does it look like to have a Pope who's animated by the charism of a religious order? That might have opened that question and made that more of a discernment for the College of Cardinals than it was before. So that will be interesting to kind of keep tabs on. as well as I'm not sure how much we'll know, right? The discernments of the conclave are confidential. But that's something that's interesting to think about.
Well,
They are
to that point,
Go ahead. Sorry, Ann. Go ahead,
I
Bridget.
was yeah, I was just going to say to that point, Annie, of a pope who takes some of the charism and spirituality of religious order. Even with Francis, we saw how many people, when he declared his name was Francis, said, "Oh, this must be for Francis Xavier, the great Jesuit saint," and then he had to come and say, "No, this is for Francis of Assisi." And the closeness to creation and the care for the environment and the listening to the experience of the church in the Amazon and environmental degradation, how that really converted him. So will we see the Pope from a religious order? We don't know, but I think that the influence of spirituality, even outside of formal membership in an order, is something that defined Francis's pontificate in a really significant way. And as I've been listening to the homilies at the various masses over the past week in the Vatican, it's an interest, and the interviews with cardinals, it's been heartening to me to hear how many times that phrase of his, the smell of the sheep, has come up. So I think when we have that question of what will be the relationship of the next pope to people and how will technology fit into that, certainly it seems like that's something that many cardinals have taken to heart as being called to be people who have the smell of the sheep, who are with people, and who are deeply formed by that. And I wonder if we'll see too, if we have a pope who carries on the legacy of Francis, more statements that challenge the way that we use technology. That on the one hand, it's a great unifier, and I'm so grateful to be part of this conversation here from Chicago. And on the other hand, the environmental impact of the ways that we use technology. So how do we learn to be close to one another in a way that doesn't privilege just the closeness of those of us in Western countries with the high-speed internet access, but looks at the impact of water access and use of natural resources on people in the global South.
Mm.
If I may quickly add to the relevance of the Pope, people were growing disenchanted with John Paul II, the Great, as he was getting older. Benedict, there wasn't a closeness, if you will. There was a closeness to Francis because of his charism of warmth. But I think that's going to be hard to continue. And such that I think the energy of people's faith around whose leadership will be more localized. Pope Francis saw him as the bishop, himself as the Bishop of Rome, as a unifier. But he said the action is in the local diocese and the local parish, and saying to lay people, take and be empowered in your faith journey and your questions, not look to Rome and to one person. No, Christ is within us, listening to the Spirit, discern, and together in a much more recreative way, renovating, reforming the church. So I think that's where some of the energy in the future is, locally rather than looking over to Rome.
And it's ways in which, as charismatic and as inspiring as Pope Francis was, a pope with a slightly lower profile might allow the church throughout the world to grow more with a little more of the sort of what he called a healthy decentralization.
Yeah.
I like Annie's point too of there's different ways of being a pastor, being a pope. I think there's different ways of being a pastor. The one thing that I remain deeply hopeful about is that in previous papacies, often cardinals were chosen based on what city they lived in, or whether or not they agreed with the Pope on every one of the Pope's main policy or theological priorities. And Pope Francis didn't really do that. I mean, he appointed cardinals who disagreed with him on some important theological and pastoral issues, but he appointed men who were deeply interested in being pastors rather than being politicians, deeply interested in leading the people of God rather than getting ahead for themselves. So that's, for me, gives it the most hope. And also, I think I said this yesterday, might be a thing to hold in mind. As soon as the new pope was elected, there's going to be a billion pieces about, we found this thing that he said in 1995 to the school. Take a breath from that, because the papacy changes people, and also the people change, people grow and change over time, and I'm much more interested in seeing how the person is as Pope rather than only looking at what they said 20 years ago. I'm afraid we're going to run out of time, and I want to have a couple of quick announcements before I thank our panelists. Many of you might already be on our list of events that we do on faith formation here at Holy Trinity Parish, but if you're not, you can go to that website and sign up for our weekly e-letter on that. Next Sunday, unfortunately, only in person and not virtually, but next Sunday, to go to directly to Bridget's point about water use, we are having theologian Christiana Zenner, who's coming down from Fordham University to talk about water to kick off our series on baptism. Why not talk about the role of water and how we think about water within Catholic social teaching? The following weekend, Dr. John Borelli of Georgetown University, who many of you know, that will be on the weekend of May 11th, as well as again on Monday, May 12th, talking about ecumenical dialogue and our shared baptism. And then the other thing that's starting this week is our book discussion group that meets every Thursday, starting at 7:15 p.m. We're starting a new book this week. We're starting The Jesuits, get it closer. The Jesuits in the United States, A Concise History, emphasis on the concise. He fits the whole thing in a very slender volume. And we only read about a chapter at a time. So if you're interested in that, and I actually I can also email you, we uploaded the first chapter for people that want to look at it briefly before buying it or haven't gotten their book yet in time for a discussion this Thursday. So always email me with any of those questions, and we'll hope to see many of you for other Holy Trinity adult faith formation events.
I may put in a plug for this Wednesday. It's the 50th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War. We're having Mass, 5:30 regular Mass, followed by a 6 to 7 adoration where the names of those who served and those who died in Vietnam are mentioned and are prayed for. So all are welcome for the prayer service itself, 6 to 7 in the chapel on Wednesday, April 30th. And no collection. Okay.
Thank you to all of you who joined us tonight for this conversation, and a special thank you to our speakers, to Annie, to Bridget, to Father Kevin, for sharing your thoughts, your wisdom, and we'll see you at another time soon for some other event, and let us all keep praying both for the repose of the soul of our late Pope Francis and praying for our cardinals and for the entire church as they begin the preparation for the conclave. Have a good evening, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you. God bless.